Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And as promised, it's been quite a few days, but I am returning to the month's loose theme on, for Pride Month, which of course is queer or LGBTQIA plus films. And not quite inexplicably, but as is the way of these things, I've lent again towards the modern coming-of-age drama, or drama with comedy in it, maybe, sort of. But this time, from the perspective of a female queer character. And that is the film TheHalf Of It. And this is a curious little film, I must confess. I was quite worried going into it, because the name rang a bell vaguely, but it definitely was one of these small American independent films that went without a great deal of fanfare, and isn't hailed as a powerful queer narrative. And so going in, and then once I started it, immediately, of course, it's a coming of age drama. It's set in a high school in sort of somewhere in America. I actually never quite got where it was, but some small town with a very religious slant to it. And I just thought, small town America with quite conservative religious ideals, mostly high school setting, insular, introverted lead character, and I just thought I'm worried that this is going to be very conventional insofar as it's telling a queer story, and yet that it would fall into quite familiar tropes. So it even has things like a meet cute between our lead and her love interest. And it does do something interesting. I mean, so it's about the fact that she, Ellie, is a ghost writer for most of her school, seemingly, where she writes essays for them. And then Paul, a very unconfident, inarticulate guy, basically approaches her and says, "Would you write love letters for me to this girl?" However, as things transpire, Ellie also has, it seems pretty early on, but then as the letters continue, develops a deeper relationship to this girl, Astrid. And that is an interesting narrative. Again, I was worried to start with. I was worried it was going to continue these sort of played out high school tropes, but just simply with gender slightly swapped or mixed up. But it doesn't quite go that way. It actually does give us some rich character work. And I have to say, the three leads, Ellie, Paul, and Asta, are all actually pretty compelling characters once you get into the meat of it. Ellie is quite a rich character. And of course, I don't know much about the director Alice Wu, but there does feel like there's something of sort of the personal experience. This is actually, she's not even a second generation immigrant. This is a girl who was born in China, but was mostly raised in America with a dad who speaks English, but not very well, who lost her mum as a teenager, and just has no real place in this sort of small town, sort of conservative ideology. But that does feel like a rich, layered character there that feels personal, as if, and you can tell sometimes when a storyteller is conveying a personal experience into and channeling that into a character. And again, the lead actress really does give you a quite rich, nuanced character with a lot of colour, and yet she does fall into the category of actors who internalise a lot, and it's very much about, sort of hiding and diverting and using methods to not express emotion or not have attention, which can be frustrating, as I've mentioned before, in that sort of school of, some actors really lean into that, and it becomes quite frustrating to follow a lead character who deeply internalizes. But a lot of her characteristics and personality are drawn out through her relationships, particularly with her father, particularly with Paul, and particularly with Asta. And again, Paul, who initially comes across like a more traditional American jock character, actually again has a fairly rich, deep personality. I mean, rich and deep insofar as he's a guy who loves living in his small town and has a passion, but as opposed to playing a sort of she's all that style, oh, he's a jock, but then his change comes from his experience with someone else, he actually does already demonstrate an interesting personality. He's someone who, loves cooking. He comes from a big family, and his passion is to basically develop these things called taco sausages. And again, these things are small and intimate, and they're characterful, but that actually makes him a compelling personality and someone who has good chemistry. If anything, Asta is the character who gets the least served. Towards the third act, you do get a better sense of her character, but the things that I like about her also play into the negatives of the story. But just to sort of veer from that for a second, the core of it works really well, and the interplay between these three, and the fact that it becomes more about, I suppose, sort of who is the better partnership, whether that be romantic or platonic, and how the dynamic of these three characters all work quite well. The big issue, as I mentioned, for me was the setting. And although the function of the setting is supposed to be in contrast to the character, the whole point of this place is that it's set as this sort of small town, sort of old-fashioned, slightly grim, slightly just very stuck in its ways kind of place. Unfortunately, as a setting, it does mean it sometimes is hard to watch. It's not a setting I'm particularly interested in. And that sort of feeds into the structure of the narrative. Because when the story is about our leads and their families, and about their sort of identities and how they're growing as teenagers, I actually really like it. When it's about things like the high school, anything which is about sort of the high school and the structure based around the high school immediately starts to lose me. There are certain set pieces around a talent show, a football game, these sort of all-American, experiences that I just have no interest in, and I find them restrictive and kind of boring compared to when we're shown the character interplay. The other thing that I struggle with is it does feel like a film that's conflicted. The title is apt because the half of it does kind of represent the problem, where it does feel like a film that has sort of two different personalities to it. I mean, actually, you could say even more, because on the one hand, you have a much more sort of personal, modern experience of a queer teenager and her sort of coming out of her shell and developing an identity and sort of growing beyond the town she lives in. And that's a fairly contemporary narrative that I would put alongside films like Alex Strangelove. But then there's this other side of the film, which feels more like a much older, like, there are certain aspects that feel almost like a 1950s, 60s narrative. There's a certain sequence between the two girls where they're just spending time together, and there are romantic undertones, but it's never explicit. And the way the setting is played out, and the fact that they have a radio, because their phones have no signal, and the way they spend time together, feels like it's from a much older film, and on some degree that is intentional. That perhaps plays into classic film language and the way that you would represent same-sex relationships in films where in time periods where those things weren't permitted, but it does make the film feel like all of a sudden it makes it feel like we're in a different film. Similarly, the attitudes and the attributes of some of the characters and the way that they'll switch from sort of contemporary ideas, and they're sort of constantly talking about emojis and Venmoing, and then it'll switch to sort of ideas and principles that are much more rooted in like a 70s or 80s sort of attitude towards things like queer characters or sort of ideas about there's a strange subplot about the love interest girl for both our leads, you could say, for both Ellie and Paul. That the love interest girl is actually kind of sort of involved with another character, but it's sort of an obligation thing, and that feels like a different film. That feels like a much older film where it's about this girl who's sort of bound by obligation to marry this guy, and again that doesn't feel very contemporary and very very out of sync with what some other aspects of the film. And again, it has this sort of preacher character who's, I think, the father of the love interest, and sort of his influence and his sort of preaching. And again, it feels not like the same film as other aspects are. Unfortunately, the other thing is that it does slip into romantic comedy elements. Now, I don't categorise this film as a romantic comedy. It is a romance film. And some of the characters have sort of wry and witty personalities, and there are moments where they're funny. But it's not, broadly speaking, structured like a comedy. It's structured like a drama. Except for certain moments where it feels like it falls back into more traditional comedy setups. And that, again, kind of loses me. And it sort of breaks the narrative a little for me when certain set pieces become more comedic than they need to be. I suppose just to finish off, it's interesting because there is another part of this film that I suppose is more an idea of what I wanted the film to be and where I thought it was going than what the film actually was. And it sort of fits into the idea that media as a whole will always, as particularly films, because films are represented by people of a certain age group and sort of the leaders of filmmaking of a certain age and demographic, that there is filmmaking and TV, film and TV will always feel a little behind modern ideas, and sometimes that's not always the case, but broadly there is this concept that they are just that little bit behind. Because as I was watching this, and in a sort of 2021, when we have ideas of sort of polyamory and pansexuality, and sort of a broader idea of what love and romance can be, and as I see these three develop relationships between each other, I kind of was wanting it to explore a much more complex idea of sexuality and gender. That there are even hints towards sort of ways the gender identity of Ellie could go. But it's more complex ideas of relationships, of different structures of relationships and different kinds of sexuality that, unfortunately, on some level it goes back to a much more conventional idea of sort of queer representation, and perhaps that is still a good that is a good thing, and again it is the representation of what I think is someone's experience of this, and it shouldn't just be more than it needs to be because characters have chemistry. In fact, the other thing I would say is it's very rare that we get male-female friendships depicted in television in a really intimate way, without it sort of leaning towards romance. And this film actually does depict that, and I have to credit it. It's just, I think, as I was watching it and my expectations, I was hoping it would do something more radical than I think it wanted to go. interesting film, and again, I can't say I regretted seeing it. Once it sort of was all said and done, I actually thought it came together really well and made me empathise with characters who I initially was a little bit hostile towards in terms of depiction and arc. But actually, yeah, they were a really fun group of characters to follow, and I genuinely felt I understood the coming of age nature of it. That being said, I realise that for this month I've sort of been covering a lot of coming of age films. I'm going to try to veer away from that. I know I've at least got one more in the pipeline, and I do want to look at some other kinds of representation of LGBTQIA in film, but we'll see as it goes along. It's not a set path. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video because it's all helped me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. And check out my back catalogue of over 150 videos. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about films and TV series. And I share the links to these videos once they're on YouTube. Thank you for joining me. Take care.